All right, period 6, part 2. Somebody started calling me and it cut the video off, so we're breaking it into 2. There's just a few more things on period 6, part 2. Okay, social Darwinism. Right before that, we were talking about the Dawes Act, and during period 6, you have the end of the Plains Indians Wars. Effectively, all of the manifest destiny moving across Indian territory brought an end to the Plains Indians and their way of life, of course, the buffalo. And so I think it was shortly before 1900. I'm trying to think when the Battle of Wounded Knee was the very last battle, and it was sometime before 1900. So the West was settled, the frontier was closed, and the Native Americans had been effectively defeated. About 30 years later, Native Americans are going to also get the rights of citizenship. For a long time, they operated in a completely different paradigm than the rest of minority groups within the country, in part because they wanted to reserve their heritage and didn't want to be dumped into immigrant status because they weren't immigrants. So, but effectively, the Plains Indians Wars come to an end. Okay, and what was social Darwinism? Okay, so the Darwin's theory of evolution, of course, was introduced and got a lot of pushback, but it was effectively applied in the business world. So some of those titans of industry would say, well, as Darwin said, the survival of the fittest is true. Within a free market economy, the winners and losers are for the most part chosen by destiny. Do they have what it takes? Do they have the smarts? And there just came to be an acceptance that there were those and there were those. And whichever category you fell in was more or less determined based upon what God had wired you with, or what destiny had wired you with, and you just had to accept it. And so that was applied to business as well, some of those cutthroat tactics, and it justified for a very long time the mistreatment of employees by the employers, and it squashed the labor movements in that particular era. And so that was applied to that. The social gospel, which is a little different than social Darwinism. Social gospel said that it had nothing to do with Darwin, obviously. So in the rearview mirror of the Second Great Awakening, we'll leave it that way, people were burdened with the understanding that the poorest among us were effectively handicapped by the fact that most of them were immigrants, didn't speak the language, didn't understand the customs, and had no power. They were powerless. And so preachers and the church and such, our culture encouraged people to get their hands dirty and to go into those immigrant communities and help them, and that's what Jesus would want them to do. It's kind of like a, what was it? What would Jesus do? WJD? WWJD, hello. What would Jesus do movement of the Gilded Age. And there was the suggestion that if you weren't participating in these sorts of activities, that you weren't really a Christian. And sometimes it was just simply that our acts of kindness and help and charity should be a manifestation of who we are as Christians. So it wasn't necessarily that you earned salvation that way, although most historians in these secular textbooks, that's how they couch it, because they don't necessarily understand the gospel. But for the Christian community, it didn't necessarily mean they were earning salvation through their good works, but that because they were Christians, they should be doing the works of Jesus. And so that led a lot of them, like Jane Addams, a lot of these settlement houses that were built in urban communities and immigrant communities to help them to incorporate them into our community with no strings attached. There wasn't like, if you do this, then you need to give up your way of life. It was a no strings attached, we're just here to help you. Jane Addams never married. She committed her life to these works. So I hear my doggy barking in the background. And then the last thing on period 6 is Plessy versus Ferguson. So period 6, which ends in 1898, leading up to American imperialism and the Spanish-American War, ends on the note of the plight or the situation for Black Americans in America as we approach 1900. And unfortunately, things were not going well for Black Americans. Many of them in the Exodusters had moved into Kansas looking for work. Many of them moved into the cities looking for work, and just really thinking that perhaps the northern lands and the big cities would have more opportunities than down in the South. But you guys know what Plessy versus Ferguson is, a huge Supreme Court case. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as facilities, public accommodations and facilities are equal in opportunity and equal in station, I'll use that word, then they were constitutional, and it wasn't a violation of constitutional rights of Black Americans. And so Mr. Plessy got on a white train car. His identification said he was a Black man because he was like 1/8 Black or something like that. They asked him to move, he didn't, he got arrested, and then that case made its way to the Supreme Court. Mr. Plessy did this on purpose. He was a member of a civil rights organization that was trying to find cases to challenge the segregation in the South, and unfortunately, in a shocking turn of events, what Mr. Plessy thought, and I'm trying to think of the NAACP may have represented him, I can't remember now. In a shocking turn of, actually it hadn't been, no, ignore that. In a shocking turn of events, rather than proving that segregation was wrong, the Supreme Court ruled that it was fine as long as everything was separate, and everything could be separate, but it had to be equal. And that led to 50, 60, 70 years of segregation in the South, and it basically backed up by that Supreme Court case. So that's what Plessy versus Ferguson is. So that ends period 6. So I'm going to stop my video, upload it, and then I'm going to start the last one, period 7, which we just finished. So it should sound pretty fresh, and I can probably get through it quickly. Bye.